I have adopted this in my decision making on a scale that I think would probably scare most people. But the fact is that I've gotten into a place, in part, or maybe even in large part, because of this practice, where I feel so aligned with myself. And, the proof is in the pudding, right? Like, my business is growing. I am now in a position where I am helping to create abundance for multiple teams of other people, right? And I'm doing it by making many business decisions throughout the day, ultimately leaving the choice to my intuition and my inner knowing. Hello, New Humans fam, and welcome to this episode of the New Humans for New Earth podcast. If you're just joining us for the first time, on this podcast, we believe that every human alive today has a role to play in helping to co-create a new, more loving and more aligned world. Here, we introduce you to wisdom, perspectives, and information to support and inspire you in making more aligned choices in your life. Here, we focus on concrete, actionable things you can do in your life right now to help bring about New Earth. Before we jump into this episode today, I just wanted to take a moment to ask, how's your nervous system doing? Yeah, so I would like to sort of start this off by doing a little grounding exercise, just kind of coming into our bodies and into our hearts and letting go of some of the, I'll say, frenetic energy or just anxious energy that's kind of going around right now. Yeah, so if you feel called and if you're in a safe place to do so, I'd like to invite you to close your eyes and put one of your hands over your heart and one of your hands on your stomach. If you have a preferred grounding exercise that you'd like to do, please go ahead and do that. But otherwise, put one of your hands on your heart and one of your hands on your stomach. And let's take 3 deep breaths in through our nose and exhale through the mouth. So breathing in and out. I'll do that 2 more times. So breathing in and out. And go ahead and do that 1 more time. And I'd like to also invite you, whether mentally or out loud, just to remind yourself, I love you so much. I'm here for you. I got you. You are so good. You have such a beautiful heart. And again, if it's safe for you, you might just shake out your hands, and if you really want to get into it, I like to kind of jump a little bit and kind of get my whole body in there and just kind of just shake everything out. Yeah. Once you're ready, you can open back up your eyes, sort of just feel that in your body. All right, y'all ready? Okay. So I actually want to talk about something that might strike people as a little less concrete than what I like to focus on today. And that is tapping into your intuition. Now, there are plenty of methods to do this. I'm just going to talk about what I use in my day-to-day and sort of my journey with it. And my inspiration for wanting to do this was I got by AI recently. I was sort of wondering, when is it going to become so realistic that I'm not going to be able to tell the difference? And it happened. And, as far as AI goes, right? I mean, just like everything else, it has light and dark. And we don't have to agree on whether AI is good for humanity, bad for humanity. I mean, again, light and dark, right? So, but this experience of getting got by AI really made me sort of wonder about, I don't know, just reflecting on the role that AI is playing right now. And I'm sure it's multifaceted because this reality is complex, right? But, the sort of insight that came to me is that as we're in this moment of transition from one reality into another, there is this role that AI is playing for us, right? Which is it's kind of dissolving our attachment to a particular reality, right? So because what we typically rely on is evidence of what's happened, right? So a video, a photo, right? Because we can no longer rely on that being an accurate representation of, frankly, anything that's actually quote unquote true, right? It's like it's undermining the kind of evidence that we have relied on for so long, which is the evidence of our senses and the external world. Now, there's a whole conversation that could be had about like the actual truth of all of that, right? But nonetheless, this has sort of been our default. And so I'm wondering now if part of the light, right, quote unquote light of AI is playing this role of liberating us from the idea of a set truth, a set reality, and instead forcing or encouraging us to look inside and connect with our inner knowing, to connect with what our body is telling us, with what our intuition is telling us, with what our soul is telling us is the truth. And I think, tapping into that in your day-to-day is important anyways. But in this moment where, the institutions and I'll say kind of like the major outlines of the reality and the social construct and sort of the way that we've been organizing ourselves start to dissolve, start to lose their logic and their power, frankly, as we start to kind of see through the veil of it all. The question is kind of like, okay, but what do we use to help inform our decisions? How do we ground our decision-making process? How do we know where the shore is? This question is particularly salient because there is a narrative that is, I referred to it in episode, I think it was 8, as like the siren song, right? There are very loud, very, I'll say monied interests and influences that would like you to sort of assume that reality is going one particular way, right? And they want you to buy into that narrative. And if you don't have sort of something else to ground into, right, in this moment of transition, in this moment where everything's dissolving, in this moment where the ground seems to be shifting under your feet, then it's really easy to get pulled into that, right? And, I want to have an episode about this later, but it's also just, we don't always acknowledge this in sort of our day-to-day waking life, right? But as a collective, we are all connected, right? So the more and more people that buy into that narrative, the more and more people that allow themselves and their nervous systems to become dysregulated into and because of that narrative, the more there's sort of this collective pull that way. And it's, I mean, frankly, for most people, I think it's unconscious, right? And it's very natural. It's very natural when you're being bombarded with, I mean, effectively, how do I want to put this? When you were being bombarded by harmful energies, aka energies that are intended to dysregulate you. I mean, this is a form of like, I mean, I don't want to talk about psychological warfare, but I mean, it is a form of psychological warfare, right? I mean, the bombs in Iran are not just falling on the school children in Iran. They have impacts on everyone worldwide, right? So this mechanism of control, yeah. So how do we prevent ourselves from getting swept up? How do we prevent ourselves from being just another pawn in this game? And instead, how do we ground into our own inner knowing, in our own truth, in our own faith in New Earth? And how do we continue to, what's the word? I don't know, embody that faith so that when we look out into the world, we can continue to see it and we can continue to see the opportunities to take steps towards it rather than that nervous system shutdown that we are all being encouraged into. So that's my motivation for talking about intuition today. I think intuition is so important as well because, you know, I'm sure you're familiar with this, right? But the mind, as powerful a tool as it is, right? The mind is capable of incredible things. I think if we rely on our mind solely for understanding this world, for decision making, et cetera, it's really easy to get trapped in sort of what's called like analysis paralysis, right? There will always be pluses and minuses to every decision, right? Always risks, always unknowns. And so from what I've experienced, and I'm sure you can relate to this as well, it's like if you rely solely on your mind to guide you through life, oftentimes it's like you can't even make a single decision because you can see arguments for both, right? And so, you know, and the other thing about the mind is if you're willing to get into it, I mean, you can convince yourself of basically anything, right? So for me, tapping into my intuition and my inner knowing is so useful because after I've done a certain amount of that analysis on both sides, after I've identified sort of the live options for me, right? Say I'm facing a decision. I see option A and option B, right? I see reasons for either. Rather than sit there longer and try to figure out like which one is the right one with my mind, I actually just tune into my intuition and allow it to tell me what the right step forward is. And that just allows me to cut through, effectively wasting my time considering this choice yet again. And, you know, depending on your position in this world, right? I mean, you may be faced with hundreds of decisions in a day. And it's just like, at a certain point, you get decision fatigue, right? And I'll talk about this a little bit more later in the episode, you know, I believe that our intuition, our inner knowing, I mean, frankly, our soul, right, has access to such a deeper, more complex sort of understanding of the full orchestration of just everything that's happening in this world that our rational minds can't access. And so when I tap into my intuition to help me make a decision, I actually feel like I don't know. I guess maybe some like skeptics, right, might feel like this is actually just putting on a blindfold and sort of throwing a dart at the wall, right? But I don't see it that way. I see it as, I've done my research and now I'm saying, hey, intuition, hey, soul, I know you know more about this than I do. Tell me which way to go. And I'll talk more about sort of what my method of choice is later in this episode, but I will just share with you that like I have adopted this in my decision making on a scale that I think would probably scare most people. But the fact is that I've gotten into a place in part, or maybe even in large part, because of this practice where I feel so aligned with myself. And, the proof is in the pudding, right? Like my business is growing. I am now in a position where I am helping to create abundance for multiple teams of other people, right? And I'm doing it by making many business decisions throughout the day, ultimately leaving the choice to my intuition and my inner knowing. So I feel no qualms about engaging in this practice at the level that I do. And, sort of part of what I'm trying to say to you is like, if you're not already doing something like this in your life, it might be helpful, right? And I think let's just speak into this, right? Like the skeptic, the person who thinks that intuition is really just I've had someone describe it to me as like, it's really your rational mind still, but it's just like it's contemplating data and facts on a level that like you're not like consciously aware of. Like it's happening on such a scale that you're not able to articulate all of the sort of different facts that it's going through. To put it lightly, I think that's bullshit. Yeah, I mean, my experience with this is actually that I am tapping into my soul. I feel like I'm tapping into my soul, and that feels really special. So my journey with getting reconnected with my intuition really started in earnest after my divorce. And sort of in the aftermath of my divorce, I realized that I had actually really overridden my intuition in getting married in the first place. And I just want to pause here for a moment and just kind of do a little bit of a meta comment because, I haven't spoken much publicly about my divorce and I don't expect to get into any sort of details here, right? But I do just want to take a moment to acknowledge that that relationship was in many ways so beautiful. And I'm really grateful to have shared that with my ex-husband. I'm really grateful for all of the ways that I grew and the person that I am today as a result of that relationship. And my ex-husband and I shared some memories that I will cherish for the rest of my life, no question. And, the end of it for me was unexpected and devastating because, I believed fully that that person was my soulmate. And my belief and I think my expectation, which is the warning, right? Y'all know it's going to go bad when we start talking about expectations. But my expectation was that that person was going to be in my life for the rest of my life, was going to be my husband for the rest of my life. So I was truly devastated at the end. And, it took a lot of work to be able to sort of hold that devastation with the beauty of it and to yeah, to be able to sort of have both without allowing the way that it ended to corrupt the beauty of what we shared. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I see now too. I mean, I was a bit in my maiden energy then, and what I've had to come to grips with is just that relationship was meant to be for a moment, and that doesn't detract from its value or its significance in my life. And yeah, so I've gotten to a place where I can kind of hold that, and I think that can be very difficult. I mean, shoot, I lived it. It can be very difficult to get there, right? And life is complex, and the roles that we play in each other's lives can be equally complex and multidimensional, right? So, and I don't believe in mistakes, right? So, as I said at the beginning, whereas I realized in retrospect that in marrying him, I overrode my intuition. I think that was not a mistake insofar as part of what I needed to learn was the importance of listening to my intuition. And so the experience of having that warning from my intuition and ignoring it, and then finding myself on the other side, like, frankly, just like feeling utterly destroyed. I mean, it was a very powerful lesson, right? Yeah. So, having gotten that out of the way, in the weeks leading up to my marriage or my wedding, I got this just very heavy sense of foreboding. And, there's talk about cold feet. I feel like people don't really talk about that quite as much anymore, but that's not what it was for me. Like it never occurred to me to not follow through with marrying my ex-husband. But there was this sense of doom that kind of started popping up for me like a week or two beforehand. And I just remember feeling this and wondering, like, what is this? Right? And I pushed it aside. I was like, well, of course you're having second thoughts. I mean, getting married is no small thing, And the other thing that happened in the week before my marriage was I got this enormous zit, like right on my forehead, or maybe it was my nose. I don't know, but it was very prominent. And and then we were meant to get married one day. We went to Mexico and kind of had like a vacation wedding, right? We were meant to get married on, I think, the 24th of January. But that day, everyone had food poisoning. It's just like one thing after another was just like, Queenie, like, you sure about this? But I was very much like, whatever, we'll just do it tomorrow. That's fine. That's fine. And, my husband and I ended up going on a walk that day, and we happened upon this like private beach that, we didn't know about. We were just going out on a walk, and, we saw this beach and we're like, wow, this is where we should do the ceremony, And the next day, everyone felt better. We had this beautiful venue that we hadn't even planned on. And, I became one of those people who got married barefoot on the beach. Like, I never thought I would be one of those people, but I was. I mean, frankly, it was beautiful. It was like the perfect sunset broke out as soon as the ceremony was over. And there were some what are they called? Pelicans. There were pelicans kind of hanging out on the rocks nearby during the ceremony. And someone told me that they're like good omens for relationships and all of that. And once it was done, I just felt so much joy. I mean, there's photos of me from like immediately after the ceremony, and I'm just beaming. But then fast forward 3.5 years or whatever it was, and I was divorced, living in an apartment by myself that I had moved into kind of suddenly. And I just felt so lost. So in addition to my husband, right, he had 4 children. And between being married, being a stepmom to 4 kids, working, doing all my little pet projects that I'm always doing, I was very much in that people pleasing, like I'm going to earn your love sort of place. And because there had been so many other people in my life that needed or demanded care, when I found myself in a situation where it was just me, I couldn't even begin to answer for myself the question of, what do I want to do right now? What would bring me joy in this moment? What's Queenie want? I was like, literally, I had no answer to that question. And so, I knew that this was a passing thing, but I also knew that wasn't going to change unless I put some effort in. So something that I did for like 3 to 6 months after my divorce was I would literally just sit on my couch and wait until something occurred to me. And then I would get up to go do whatever it was, right? But the point is that I was sort of giving myself enough time for that, for the voice of myself to surface, because it had been drowned out and crowded out of my life for so long. And in those first few weeks, when I would finally get up and sort of take steps to go do something, halfway through, I would stop and I'd be like, I don't know if that was the thing. And then I would turn back around and go sit on the couch some more and just contemplate and wait for it to come. In this time period, one of the revelations that came to me was acting on your intuition will help repair the relationship with your soul. And something that started happening for me was I'd notice a voice. We've made hearing voices so taboo, but depending on how your intuition talks to you, it might be a voice, it might be an image, right? It might just be, sometimes I get like inner nudges, literally, like it's almost like I can feel my life force like pushing me forward or actually holding me back. I don't know if that resonates with you, but yeah, so I had this revelation: acting on your intuition will help repair the relationship with your soul. And I started noticing, like, for instance, I went to the grocery store. And as I was walking by the tofu display, I heard like, oh, some tofu would be good. And I brushed it aside. I said, no, like I have some at home. I had this memory that I had some at home. I don't need tofu. Thanks though. And later on, further down in the grocery store, I guess I must have looped back around, or maybe there was more. But again, this message of you should get some tofu popped up. And again, I brushed it aside. And I get home and lo and behold, I have no tofu. That was a false memory or something, right? And this kind of thing kept happening. And what I noticed was that every time I brushed it aside, I'd regret it. I'd be like, man, I should have listened to that voice because I am without tofu or whatever it was, right? And so I determined to listen. I was like, look, okay, I've heard this voice. I know what it sounds like. I know what it feels like. When it comes up, I'm going to listen. And that's been really helpful. And there are times when I've got questions and the voice ain't there, right? So, it's been helpful for me sort of as I've moved forward on this reconnecting with my intuition journey to develop and discover sort of other methods of tapping in. So one of the first methods that I got introduced to was this method of just getting quiet, asking a question, and waiting for the answer to sort of surface, right? My therapist at the time introduced me to this. And the truth is that I always felt puzzled by this one. And it's not because it never works. Oftentimes it does. I mean, if you haven't tried this, try it, right? Just to give you an example from my life recently, I was thinking about what I should title one of my episodes. And, that's one where it's not really a yes, no, right? So it's kind of harder to apply some of these other methods I'm going to tell you about. And so I literally was just like, okay, I need a title. Will you just come up with one and let me know what it is? And I will just continue about my day and assume that at some point it's going to surface. One of the inefficiencies for me about this method is, the sort of wait and find out kind of aspect of it, right? It's like, if I have a decision to make, like, I'm trying to make that decision now. But I think fundamentally the reason this one doesn't work so well for me is because it feels very mind-based still. And, again, we're so focused on the mind, or historically have been so focused on the mind, give primacy to the mind. I mean, I think, therefore I am, Descartes, that feels really natural to us. But again, remember, analysis paralysis. Remember, you can convince yourself of everything. And remember as well all of the different voices that have been programmed into your mind. Your parents, whatever voice of, like, the critic, right? Whoever is guilting you or judging you or telling you you're not good enough, like that voice, don't listen to that voice, but it's in there, The voice of all kinds of companies who are trying to convince you of something, like you're not pretty enough, you don't have enough stuff, like someone's looking at your skin and judging you about it, whatever, Someone thinks you ain't sexy enough, So for me, it's like with this method, you're kind of still in the muck of it all, but kind of hoping that the right voice comes to surface. And look, absolutely invest time in identifying, I'll say again, the voice that your intuition or your highest self or your soul talks to you in, because that exercise alone will change your life. But for that reason, this method is not my favorite. So the second method of tapping into your intuition that I want to introduce you to is more of a heart-centered practice. And, I came to this independently, but I'm not trying to assert ownership of it, right? There's all kinds of examples of things where people kind of independently come to the same conclusions or practices, right? And I just believe in that case, it's like we're tapping into some deeper truth, right? But so this practice can be particularly helpful if you're contemplating multiple sort of ways forward. So for me in my life, I went out to dinner last night and I wasn't entirely sure between two dishes. This is a silly example, but it's just what came to mind. And so to use this practice here, what I do is I take one of the options in my mind, and then I bring my awareness down to my heart. And I'll even put my hands over my heart just to kind of help anchor my awareness there. And I'll just contemplate one of those options. And I'll see how my heart feels in response. And then I'll do the same with the other option. And typically what happens is there is one option that makes my heart feel more expansive, more alive, more excited, more excitement maybe isn't the right word, but just there's, I don't know, it's like an enlivening kind of feeling, joy. I mean, you'll need to experience or experiment with this to sort of figure out what your heart's yes and no feels like. But typically, no for me feels more contracted. It feels more stagnant. Yeah, there's kind of like a pause or a stop sort of feeling to it rather than a go or a yes sort of, or step forward sort of feeling to it for me. Yeah. So that's one that I like, and one of the reasons I particularly like it is because it brings you into your body. It's it brings you out of your mind and into your heart. And that has been life-changing for me. If you haven't yet sort of adopted a practice that's getting you in tune with your heart, right? They say like the longest journey is from your mind to your heart, right? Start doing it. I believe fully that part of one of the critical pieces of moving from the old paradigm into new earth is getting out of here and getting out of our minds and into our hearts. And that's not to say that the mind is not valuable, just as it's not to say that the ego is not valuable, right? But just to get a little bigger picture here, it's like, I think what's been going on for us is that we've been allowing the mind and the rational mind and rationality, right, to be dominant. Whereas I'll say the proper sort of relationship is actually for the heart and the soul and the intuition to be dominant, and the mind to actually be a tool and a servant of that. So, yeah. Yeah, and you can use this practice to help you get there, right? Another thing that I like to do just to kind of get into my heart is I'll just walk around or be with my hand over my heart. I kind of like to create like a little cage with my fingers and kind of just hold it over my heart space as a way to create like space for my heart energy to just kind of be in, kind of like imagining it like accumulating there. I've never talked to anyone about this, so I'm like, let me tell you all my secrets. Something else a friend shared with me once is having one hand over your heart and then the other hand over that hand. And if you kind of like just gently tap, you might be able to hear that in the microphone, but if you just sort of gently tap that outside hand, on the inside hand, there's something comforting. It's almost like reminiscent of being a baby and being held and kind of, I don't know what the word for it is, but there's just this tapping that parents often do on their babies' backs. And so it can kind of remind you and feel comfortable, remind you and feel comforting for that reason. So I like this practice better than that first one because it's heart-centered, it's body-centered, but it's still not my favorite. And the reason for that is because it's kind of squishy, it's kind of unquantifiable. I mean, I want and hope for you and everyone to be as in like conversation and in a confident conversation with their heart on a regular basis. But the reality is that there's nothing firmly observable in this method, right? And I think it could be, right, that there's really not much of a difference between your two options. And so sometimes it's not super helpful because you're like, well, my heart feels about the same about both of these. So I'm still not sure how to move forward. And of course, one option is just to say, well, it doesn't matter. Just pick one. I don't know. That one looks cooler to me for some reason, or I like the color of this, or, my mind thinks that this one looks better for whatever reason, I mean, live your life how you will, but I'm just sharing that, like, that despite the fact that I really enjoy this method, it's just not my go-to anymore. So now that I'm several years into this journey of trying to tap back into my intuition, my go-to method is using a pendulum. And for those of you watching on video, if you haven't seen a pendulum before, this is what mine looks like. They can be made out of all kinds of materials, right? This one happens to be the weight on the bottom of here. I believe it's glass, actually. And then it's just on a little metal string or chain. They can be made out of wood, crystal, oftentimes, metal, you can see that. But you can actually use pretty much anything as a pendulum is what I'm learning. I've actually recently, I have a T-ball, and I've noticed that when I'm holding it by the string, if I ask a question, it'll start to spin for me. And, I was over at a friend's house a few months ago and was talking to her about my pendulum usage, and she was like, well, I want to see. And I was like, well, I don't have my pendulum with me. And she's like, well, I've got this necklace. And it was this crystal necklace on I don't know, some sort of like cotton string. And so she was having me do pendulum work with it. So the material is actually almost negligible, right? It's really just a matter of what's the right pendulum for you. And, it's hard to explain this if you haven't worked with pendulums much before, but my sense, after having worked with this one and a few others, a number of them, frankly, at this point, is that they all kind of have their own personality. And so one of my favorite things to do, and a way that I would suggest that you actually go and choose your pendulum if you choose to use this method, is I really like to go to a store where they have them all on a rack, hanging on a rack, right? So it's just like suspended, hanging freely. And what I like to do is get my energy field close enough where I can start to see them like vibrating in response to my energy. And I mean, obviously this will probably depend on how strong your energy field is, right? But this is something I like to play with. So, so then I'll ask the pendulums, like, does anyone want to like answer some questions for me today? And again, you'll sort of start to see them moving, and I'll pick one of the ones that has sort of the biggest motion in that moment. And just what that says to me is just that pendulum is responding to my energy, or is responsive to my energy. And so it's going to give me clearer answers than one that's not as responsive, and it could be, I mean, not to like personalize it, right? But again, if you open your mind to this idea that they all kind of have their own personality, it's like, I would rather work with a pendulum that wants to work with me as opposed to one that's like, no, pass, because like, that's not a good working relationship. You know what I mean? Okay. So if you haven't worked the pendulum before, once you've got your pendulum picked out, the thing to do is to, well, first of all, clean it. So you can use a spray, like a essential oil spray smudge. My Reiki master introduced me to, they make these selenite bowls that you can get and put your pendulum in there to cleanse it. Santo Palo, some white sage, but be sparing with that one. Yeah, those are some good methods for it. And then The thing to do is to figure out what your yes and your no looks like. So the thing to do is to say, show me what yes looks like. And it will start to spin in a particular direction. My yes happens to be a counterclockwise rotation. Yours might be different. That's okay. Show me what no looks like. And so now we have a clockwise rotation for no. And what I've noticed over the years of working with this is that there is actually a variety of answers that you can get, right? So you can get a really strong yes, right? Where it's almost just like horizontal. It's whipping around so fast. Strong no, same difference. Sometimes you'll get it where it's, here, show me what an uncertain answer looks like. So you'll see that it's just swinging back and forth as opposed to in like spinning. Show me what an answer that I do not have access to looks like. Yeah. So sometimes I'll ask a question and it won't do anything. It'll actually it's almost like it gets pulled, like gravity is acting on it more strongly than usual. And so it'll just sit stock still. And what I understand from that is just that like, I'm not meant to have that answer yet. And so it's not even gonna say anything to me. It's just like, you don't have access to that, stay away. Let's see, are there any other answers that I haven't shown them yet? It's telling me yes. Oh, there's one where, so I'll notice sometimes, will you show me what like an eventual yes looks like? What does an eventual yes look like? So yeah, so there will be times where I'll ask like a question and it'll kind of move really slowly at first. And then the spin will get bigger. And kind of what I've understood from that means like, not yet, but eventually, like it might take a while. It might not resolve quickly, or it might look like a no for a minute. And then, but like eventually it will be a yes. How about, are there any other answers I should mention? No. Okay. So there are many different ways to use a pendulum. I mostly use it to, like I said, ask questions. Because the answers are sort of limited to yes, no answers, you have to ask yes, no questions. Some people say that you shouldn't ask it about the future. I disagree. I ask it about the future all the time. But just know that because the future isn't certain, that, take those answers with a grain of salt. They may change in the future depending on sort of different events that have happened in between when you asked and when you ask again, right? Because every pendulum is different and because you're different than I am, right? Like you kind of have to develop a trust and a relationship with your pendulum. I mean, it's a tool, right? And you need to figure out it just as much as it needs to get to know you. I've read that some people wear theirs as a necklace. I don't do that, but the truth is that I have gotten quite attached to my pendulum, and it's like nearby me most of the time throughout the day. I feel a little silly admitting that, but I've actually, let's just double down on vulnerability here. I actually, when I was in Costa Rica, my cat dropped swatted my pendulum off the side table that it was on onto a tile floor, and the tip of it broke off. And I was already kind of in a bit of a, we'll say, tender state in that moment anyways, but I was so distraught over the fact that my pendulum had broken that I bawled for an hour, straight up, just the wettest, child crying that I had done for maybe my entire life. I was just beside myself about it. Yeah. And then after I got back to the States, I was just like, oh, I can just super glue this back together. But if this method ends up working for you, you can get quite attached to your pendulum. So just be aware of that. And frankly, it's kind of a fun relationship to have, you know? I mean, anyone can have human friends, but I got a pendulum friend, you know? Okay, so how do pendulums work? What I've noticed, and you'll see references to this on the internet. What I've noticed is that when I ask a question, there is a very faint movement in my arm that happens, which then translates into the movement that the pendulum does, right? Some people sort of see that as evidence that pendulums are made up, that I am somehow controlling what is happening with this pendulum in a way that means that whatever answers it's telling me is just me putting my thumb on the scale, basically. So here's an example, right? It's like, does my cat, Surrey, love me so, so much? Yes, right? Now, the person who takes these little micro movements, as they're referred to, as evidence that this is just me, my conscious waking mind, saying, well, I believe that my cat loves me, so let's just make this little micro movement that's going to make the pendulum do this swing. That doesn't jive with my experience of working with the pendulum. What I've also seen sort of the explanation, and this makes more sense to me, right? There is a frequency to yes and to no. And what I believe, and what I've also read, what I believe is happening is actually that my soul, my intuition, or sometimes even beings from other dimensions, we'll talk about that more in a little bit, are actually, what's the word? It's like that energy is actually channeling through my body and manifesting as this micro movement that is then manifesting as the swing in the pendulum. It's saying yes. Is that an accurate explanation of what's going on? Yeah. And I will say what I've seen on the internet says to me that like physics can explain this, but physics is not an area that I'm well versed in. So I'm just going to say physics. And you know, if you're interested, you can kind of look into that further, right? But so rather than these micro movements being evidence that pendulums are fake, for me, it's actually further confirmation that pendulums are actually tapping into something that I'm interested in. And that the energy of that is now manifesting in this plane, and the pendulum is like evidence of it. It's an observable way to sort of see and understand and recognize that evidence. Now it's like, it's just saying yes. It's like, yes, that's exactly what it is. And this is where it gets interesting for me, right? So there's this book called Journey of Souls. And, you know, if you haven't read it, pick up a copy. It's fascinating. It's the sort of culmination of this research by a man who did hypnosis, past life regression hypnosis. And what he was able to do was to use this method to help tap into people's like otherwise unconscious memories of, or even like blocked off memories of what he referred to as life after life, or the life between lives. And one of the things that stuck with me about this book was this concept that one of the great challenges of life is actually for souls to come into right relationship with body. And I don't know that he uses these words necessarily, but the idea that I kind of got left with was that part of what souls are doing when they come into this plane and take human form is learning how to integrate with the body. And I don't really want to say control, because especially in the United States, we have such a such an emotional reaction to that. But I mean, yeah, if you think about the body as primarily, like if you think about the body by itself without a soul, as primarily a meat suit, as primarily an animal, right? And if you think that the soul and the soul operating on the body and in the body is part of what makes us conscious and, I'll say, special, quote unquote special, or even like uniquely human, then this idea starts to make sense, I think. So taking this idea, right, it's like one of the sort of tasks in life, right, is to get into alignment with our souls, get that body-soul relationship in sort of the right place, right order. You know, to sort of go back to where I was right after my marriage, it's like I was so out of sync with my soul that I couldn't even hear it anymore, right? And what's happened for me since I've started working with the pendulum, and since I've been aware of these micro movements that happen in response to me asking questions, is that I've actually been able to come to be able to feel what the yes and what the no feels like internally, right? So the pendulum just gives me like an external, verifiable sort of evidence of what energy, what frequency is moving through me in response to the question that I'm asking. But if you can really but like with repetition, right, with seeing and feeling these energies in different ways, in different contexts, I've actually been able to become internally aware of that energy and that frequency. And what I've noticed happening more recently is like, it almost feels like the pendulum is like, okay, Queenie, like I'm happy to be your pendulum, but also you can do this for yourself. And in fact, it might be the more empowered way to be, right? And so what I've noticed is that in the past year or so, sometimes it will give me wrong answers. But again, it's this personality, right? It feels like it's playing with me a little bit as a means of kind of weaning me off and almost testing my own sort of inner knowing. Because of course, I don't need the pendulum, right? It's a tool. It's a tool to help me see and ground into what's actually happening inside, what's actually happening in the conversation between me and my own soul, right? Because ultimately that's what I believe is happening when I'm working with a pendulum. So when you're working with a pendulum, of course, your answers are only going to be as good as your questions. And one of the things that I've sort of been trying to develop is like, what are good questions, right? I mean, of course, it's like, well, do I order a burger or do I order tacos, right? I mean, if you're asking your pendulum that, I think it's going to get a little tired of you, but it will give you an answer. But for me, it's like, one of the things that I try to do when I'm asking questions is I'll say, would it serve my highest self to do X? Would it serve my highest self to do Y? Would it serve me to do this right now? Would it serve me to do something else? Would I regret doing this? I mean, I try not to live in regret, but like sometimes for me, it's kind of a good kind of litmus test for a choice, right? Is like, on the other side of this, am I going to be like, man, I sure wish I hadn't done that, you know? Another really good one, sort of way to kind of contextualize a question is, would it serve the collective for me to do this? Another thing to keep in mind when you're asking questions is that you can I mean, you can ask them out loud or you can ask them in your head, right? So, is there any difference between asking questions out loud and asking them in your head? It's saying yes. Is the difference that it's easier to fool yourself when you're asking them silently? Yeah. So I would suggest that when you're first getting started with the pendulum, that you ask the questions out loud. I think the reason it's different, right, and the pendulum sort of suggesting this, right, but I think the reason that it's different is that when you're speaking, it's so much easier to sort of have your full awareness focused on the question, right? But when you're asking it silently in your mind, suddenly there's space for other stuff to come in. For instance, okay, this is another one of these criticisms, right? A lot of people criticize pendulums and pendulum users as basically just trying to elevate their own sort of internal preferences, unconscious, subconscious, unspoken, whatever, to the level of some sort of truth. And the reason for this, right, is because, yes, if you're sitting there and you want the answer to be a certain way, if you want it to be a yes, if you want it to be a no, you can for sure make that happen because your pendulum will respond to that yes or that no energy that you are holding and imposing on that moment. And it is so much easier for that to come in if you are not asking your question out loud. I guess depending on the context, I do both. If I'm with someone else, I might sort of start asking questions silently as opposed to out loud, just because I'm wanting to sort of do my own process and have my own little whatever in private. But like I've used my pendulum like in the airport, you know, but what's interesting for me about this is that working with a pendulum actually requires you to get really real with yourself about what is going on for you internally, right? Because I believe from my experience that you can tap in to your soul. You can tap into your intuition, right? But you can absolutely impact the answer with your hopes and your dreams and your preferences. And so the challenge then is to become aware of when that's happening for you, become aware of what that feels like internally, and practice letting it go. Practice just getting into that fully present, fully open, fully unattached place, right? And your meditation practice will be helpful for this. I noticed that for me, if I do a long, slow inhale while I'm silently asking the question, that will sort of open that space internally and help sort of release some of that. I mean, tension. It's essentially tension, so that I feel like I'm getting a more accurate answer. If you're having a hard time with a particular question, like maybe you're just really invested in a particular outcome or you're anxious or whatever it is, what I've found is that if I say the question out loud and repeatedly, right? So I'm really just focused on the question, that I feel like I can get more accurate answers that way. I think one of the benefits of working with the pendulum is actually becoming aware of that internal tension, right? And developing your own methods for releasing it. In my own life, I mean, I've just, how do I want to say this? Coming to be unattached, coming to release the tension, coming to have a quiet mind, right? All of these things are things that you need to work with the pendulum accurately, right? those things will also benefit you in every other aspect of your life, right? So, I mean, it's funny, right? Because I came to this tool as a way of asking questions, but it's actually led me into all of these different sort of nooks and crannies of my own physiology and consciousness and I guess just awareness that I would not have anticipated. And something, if any skeptics are out there listening to this, they're going to be like, all right, Queenie, you had me and then you lost me. But something that has sort of started a little bit more recently, right, is that I've actually become aware with my pendulum that sometimes I'm not channeling myself. Sometimes I'm actually talking with another entity. I mean, this might not be part of your worldview yet, but like there are entities that exist in all kinds of different planes that like we do not visibly see. And sometimes they want to talk to us. And frankly, I mean, there are so many entities in this dimension that we can see who are trying to talk to us, namely the Earth. And we don't hear that either, So, I mean, I think there's an argument to be made that, the problem is us. It's not them, right? It's not that other entities and other beings aren't trying to talk to us. It's that we don't know how to listen. So this moment that we're living through is, frankly, very confusing and uncertain in so many ways, right? It's like every day it feels like the ground is shifting. There's some new thing kind of demanding your attention or frankly stealing it. And, as these institutions and these sort of like shared understandings and conventions and I don't know, I'll say assumptions kind of start to dissolve. I mean, it can be harder and harder to know sort of how do I navigate? And maybe more importantly, like, am I just fooling myself in thinking that there's something better coming? And it's so easy to get pulled into that because of all the amplified voices that are telling you, you are foolish and it is dark and it's only going to get darker. But I think that part of this moment, part of why it feels like that is actually an encouragement and an invitation to look inward. And, it's funny. I was just having a conversation with someone about this, right? About the fact. I mean, I'll just call it a fact. Let's just talk about it like it's fact, right? The fact that the answers, that our connection with the divine, that, sort of that grounded truth exists inside, right? And I think, as we kind of like start to get to the close, fingers crossed, on this age, this epoch of being lost in the external, right? As we start to wrap that up, I think we can have compassion for ourselves because think about this. Our anatomy actually encourages us to believe that the answers lie outside. Because what happens when you open your eyes? You're looking outside of yourself, right? The very first thing, or one of the very first things that you do when you enter this realm is you open your eyes. And you are overwhelmed with all the sensory input, right? And in addition to that, right, that simple fact of anatomy, in addition to that, there are so many things out here that are specifically designed to catch and capture your attention. Flashing lights, which have become more and more prevalent recently, right? Sparkly people, sparkly things, sparkly places. beautiful pictures, fantasies of like places and people who figured it out. And you're like, oh shoot, I just need to figure out how to get into that picture. But it turns out that picture is AI. It's not even real, right? Or more and more, we can't even know whether what we're seeing actually says anything that's true. And so instead of despairing, right, we can take this moment as an invitation to say, okay, I know I've been lost in the external world, like so many of us, but now I know I have to go inside. And I know that my heart and my soul and my intuition will guide me in the right direction here. And so then the challenge, right, is how do I tap into that? How do I get that communication channel open and flowing? And it just takes some practice and a couple methods, your method, whatever method works for you. And if you have been doing some sort of version of this that really works for you, share it in the comments. Let's share all the tools with each other, because that's how we're collectively going to grow and find our way into New Earth together. All right, New Humans fam. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the New Humans for New Earth podcast. My name is Queenie. If you found this episode to be inspirational, helpful, or informative, please share it to your social media stories and tag us. Share it with your friends, your partner, a family member, or anyone that you love. If you loved this episode, please leave a review. And be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast. This is how we help grow the New Humans community and inspire others to join us in co-creating New Earth. This world is what we make it. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next episode.